Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is interactions between wind turbines and wildlife. This is the second part in a two-part webinar series, and this webinar will primarily be in a Q&A format. This webinar is a presentation of the Northeast Wind Resource Center, also known as the NWRC. The NWRC is managed by Clean Energy Group with support from Sustainable Energy Advantage and the Maine Ocean and Wind Industry Initiative, and it is funded with support from the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Exchange program. Our host for this webinar is Warren Leon. Warren is an executive director at Clean Energy Group and the Clean Energy States Alliance, our partner organization, and our guest speaker today is Tabor Allison. Before I pass this on to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. A couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using a telephone or you can connect using your computer's mic and speakers. As I mentioned previously, this webinar will primarily be in a Q&A format, so we have some questions already lined up that we weren't able to fully address last time in the first part of this webinar, but we definitely encourage you to submit any more questions that you might have by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we will address as many as we can. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous NWRC webinars on our website at northeastwindcenter.org/resource-library. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. As Samantha mentioned, this webinar is being done under the auspices of the Northeast Wind Resource Center, which is one of 6 wind energy regional resource centers across the country. I'm not going to go into detail because if you're on this webinar today, it probably means you listened to the previous one and you're back for part 2. So we don't need to say all the same things, but you could see the maps of the regional resource centers here. If we go to the next slide, there's a link. If you want to learn more about the Northeast Wind Resource Center, you would go to northeastwindcenter.org. That's our website, and you'll find some good information there. And you can get on the mailing list for monthly newsletter about Northeast wind issues and also a newsletter about offshore wind issues. So let's go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be hearing from Tabor Allison, who'll be responding to your questions. He did a great job sketching out the overall lay of the land in terms of what's known about wind turbine impacts on wildlife. He did that at the last webinar we had, but we had a large number of questions, and so we decided to schedule this new webinar. And I'm going to just jump into some of those questions. Tabor, because we knew some of the questions that he was going to be having to answer, has prepared slides in response to a few of the questions. But obviously, as new questions come in, he's not going to have slides on those. But let me start with the first question, Tabor, and thanks for joining us today. Is there any evidence to suggest that certain turbine models or turbine sizes result in more or fewer bird or bat deaths than other turbine models and turbine sizes?
Well, as you indicated, I do have a couple of slides here to help respond to some of those questions. And the short answer is yes, there have been some studies, and the slide that's, I hope people are able to see, lists 2 of the studies that have, and one of them fairly recent, 2013. And those studies, however, have been confined just to looking at the effects of turbine height. So there's been no comprehensive study looking at particular turbine models. By that I would mean, there are principal suppliers of turbines for wind projects across the world, and in the U.S. and North America, General Electric, GE, Vestas, Siemens are the three largest suppliers of turbines in the U.S., and nobody has looked at differences in collision rates within those categories. But within the category of turbine height, there have been a couple of investigations, and the studies are shown here, and they suggest that taller turbines kill more birds and bats than shorter turbines. In the case of the birds, I would say that conclusion is somewhat conditional. They looked at turbines, the study by Loss looked at turbines from a very broad range of sizes, from less than 50 meters to greater than 100 meters. And most turbines nowadays are, if you just look at the height of the tower, are 80 to 100 meters. And what is beginning to vary is the size of the turbine or length of the turbine blades. And so there hasn't been a detailed evaluation with turbines with larger blades, or rotor swept areas, as we say. And these larger turbines also produce more electricity per turbine. So when we typically report bird or bat fatality estimates, we report it not on a per turbine basis, but on a per megawatt basis. So it takes into account the capacity of the turbine. And so for birds, that relationship hasn't really been looked at in detail. The Barclay, Bearwald, and Groover study looking at bat fatality rates at wind energy facilities does factor in the increased rotor swept area and megawatt capacity of the turbines. And that does suggest that bat fatalities do increase as turbines get bigger. And that study, however, I think was limited geographically, so I think we do need some additional study to pin this relationship down. But I can say that at least provisionally there does appear to be an effect of height.
Thanks. And last time somebody wanted to have you put into context bird and bat fatalities by comparing bird and bat fatalities from wind energy to other impacts, such as cars and buildings. And this person was also asking, to what confidence can we have in those data on other fatalities when there aren't necessarily the same sorting reporting systems in place as there are for fatalities from wind turbines?
Well, that's also a really good question. And I prepared this table borrowing the results from a variety of publications that compare what we would call anthropogenic sources of avian fatalities. And so in the table we have buildings, communication towers, transmission lines, vehicles, wind energy, and down at the bottom, cats. So I've separated that top group of 5 sources that are generally in the category of collision fatalities. and cats being a separate source of avian mortality. And Scott Loss, who was cited in the previous slide, has done a lot of the most recent work to look at various sources of anthropogenic mortality for birds. And so the virtue of that is he's applied consistent modeling approaches to evaluating these different sources of mortality. And based on his work, what you can see is that for collisions, you know, buildings and vehicles, the number of birds that appear, you know, estimated to be killed number in the hundreds of millions. Communication towers in the low millions, and then transmission lines, which include both collisions and electrocutions, number in the tens of millions. And all of those are, you know, many orders of magnitude more than the number of birds, the cumulative estimate of fatalities, bird fatalities at wind energy facilities. And I've given you one estimate that was produced by Erickson et al. In 2014. Loss's estimate is comparable, the same order of magnitude. It's about 250,000 birds in the U.S. and North America. And I put cats in here. Loss also estimated the mortality of cats, you know, from cats, 1.3 to 3.9, or almost 4 billion is his estimate. So, you know, dwarfing all other sources of anthropogenic mortality. And to put that into context, I don't know that anybody has a really good estimate of how many land birds there are in North America, but various estimates that I've seen range from 10 to 20 billion. And so in all of North America. So you could see, for example, that cats are a substantial source of avian mortality in North America. Now, if you look at these numbers with a little more nuance, the kinds of birds that are killed at these different sources will vary. Buildings, communication towers tend to kill a lot of songbirds. Most of the birds that die are passerines. I'd say, according to some estimates, approximately 95% of the birds killed at communication towers are songbirds. And with wind energy, about 60% of the birds that are reported killed, I should use that word, reported, at wind energy facilities are songbirds. So a difference there. And we'll talk about this a little later, I think, another question. Raptors, hawks, eagles, owls comprise a higher percentage of avian fatalities at wind energy facilities than at buildings and communication towers. But then raptors are also colliding and getting electrocuted at transmission lines in high numbers. In fact, well, I say in fact, Fish and Wildlife Service has done some estimates of different sources of eagle mortality, and the electrocutions represents the highest source of mortality for eagles in the U.S. Approximately 1,000 a year are killed by electrocution, according to the service's best estimates. And then the caveat here in all these numbers is the questioner asked, we have of those numbers that you see on the screen there, the best estimates are from wind energy because we have fairly standardized protocols and reporting for fatalities, bird fatalities at wind energy facilities. The other numbers tend to be underreported and the estimates are based on just a few sets of reports. So we don't nearly have the number of studies for evaluating other sources of mortality. A few studies have been extrapolated based on a variety of assumptions, for example, that loss has used. And so, there's a fairly big caveat here. And even those of us who study wind energy, bird and bat mortality, recognize that figure for wind energy is based on only studies that are publicly available. And so there may be some geographic bias in the estimates. So, what you're seeing there on the screen really represent our best estimates, and we recognize that they have some challenges. And I would say that our estimate for wind energy avian fatalities that you see there is probably the best estimate of what you see on the screen there.
Hey, thanks very much. Let's
actually, I have another.
Yeah.
I just remember I have one. So
good.
I wanted to put this in a little more context, if I could. So, one of the questions is when we look at that mortality, to what extent does it matter to bird populations? And there's been some work done that AWWI has funded looking at the context of avian mortality or avian mortality in the context of population size. And one species, my cursor, hopefully you can see that, black-throated blue warbler. If you look at that species in particular and see how many birds, what percentage of the black-throated blue warbler population do we estimate is killed at wind energy facilities, and that number, as you can see, is pretty small. It's substantially less than 0.1% of the population dies at wind energy facilities every year. If you see how many black-throated blue warblers, based on the data available, are killed at communication towers, it's about 5%. So, that's a substantial, again, a substantial difference. And it suggests, based on the data that we have available, that wind energy for most species of birds, at any rate, is probably not an important source of mortality in the population. Okay, Warren,
Thanks. Well, let me ask you more about this wind turbines versus communication towers data here. Is the reason for the numbers being so much higher at communication towers strictly based on the number of communication towers versus the number of wind turbines, or is there something about communication towers that make them more likely to kill birds than wind turbines?
The latter. So again, if you look at that table, the estimate number of birds killed per communication tower is about a little bit, in the range of about 190 shown here, whereas with wind turbines, about 3 to 15. So just in an absolute sense, more birds are killed are reported killed at communication towers than wind turbines. And then, there are other features of communication towers. The most important one, I think, is that they're substantially taller. You can have communication towers that are up to 1,000 meters in height, and that gets the towers up into the height at which songbirds specifically are migrating, and so that's one feature. Many communication towers have guy wires that help keep the towers aloft, and those guy wires create additional surface that can intercept or a bird can collide with. And then finally, at least in the past, the lighting of communication towers may actually have served as an attraction to migrating songbirds. One thought is that when songbirds are migrating and their visibility is impaired, it's foggy, or they hit a storm system, they see the lights of the communication towers and are attracted to the tower, and that draws more birds toward the tower. And then when you have the tower and the guy wires in the surface area, the increased surface area, it results in more collisions. One question, people think about wind turbines and they have rotating turbine blades. They have the rotating blades, and whether or not the rotation of the blade increases the collision risk to birds. And at least in the case of migrating songbirds, I would say the current prevalent hypothesis is that it doesn't increase collision risk, that an operating turbine and a turbine where the blades are not rotating essentially present the same collision risk to a migrating songbird. In other words, an operational turbine doesn't pose any greater collision risk. That, I think, hypothesis needs to be evaluated further, but there are some data suggesting that's the case.
That's very interesting. One person just wrote in to ask whether companies that have communication towers, whether they have the requirements for avian studies that the wind industry has.
I can't answer that question with certainty, but all of the data that I've seen available have come from what I would call third-party surveys. So, people are aware that communication towers have what would be considered mass mortality events, where after a bad weather night during migration period, you can find thousands of birds around communication towers and buildings. And so people go out and search for them. There was one orchestrated study led by Joel Gehring, who looked at the effect of height and lighting on bird mortality at communication towers. But most of the study, unlike the wind facilities where post-construction fatality monitoring is often a requirement of the permit that a company may need to get to build a facility. I'm not aware that communication towers have any similar monitoring requirement.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's switch gears and talk about bats. Somebody had written in with a couple questions, and then a couple more came in now that relate to the same topic. and what we had previously, is it known why hoary bats seem to be more at risk from wind turbines than other bat species? In addition, is there anything unique in the hoary bat's behavior that could predict a successful protection strategy? Those are two questions we had focused specifically on hoary bats, and here are two more that are somewhat related. One is, why would wind turbines affect mating, roosting behaviors in bats? And what foraging behaviors put some bats more at risk of collision?
Well, those are all good questions, and they form the basis of active research. And I'd say, the short answer is we don't have answers to those questions or definitive answers to those questions yet. With the last question first, I'll take that because it's a more general question. There are some bat species, from what I understand, vary in their foraging strategies, and some species, and oftentimes they're cave roosting bat species, tend to forage lower to the ground and forage for insects, near the ground vegetation, which of course takes them out of the collision risk zone. Migratory tree bats tend to forage much higher, and so that takes them into the collision risk zone. So there is some speculation, call it, or hypothesizing that the foraging behavior puts migratory tree bats at greater risk of collision, and therefore explains why tree bats comprise a much higher percentage of bat fatalities, somewhere between 70 to 80% of the bat collision fatalities that have been reported are migratory tree bats. Now, when we start asking about individual species, it gets a little more difficult because it's very difficult to observe foraging behavior of individual species and identify them as individual species, because bats are foraging at night. The techniques that are being used to evaluate bat foraging behavior and behavior around wind turbines involves infrared imagery, and we're beginning to learn some interesting things from this infrared imagery. There was a recent paper published by Paul Cryan in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science looking at bat foraging behavior using infrared imagery, and the results indicate that bats tend to explore the nacelle of the turbine. So there's, seeing lots of bat activity around the nacelle, and it appears that the bat is very interested and spending a fair amount of time around the nacelle. But when, on the downwind side of the turbine, and so it's unclear why they're doing it. But there's one thinking is that if the bats are there when the turbine is not rotating, and then the wind picks up and the turbine starts rotating, the bat may be at risk, essentially in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another thought is that heat is generated by the nacelle where the generator is housed, so where the electricity is being made, and heat is given off, and that might attract insects, which in turn attract the bats. So none of this can be specified to a particular species of bat because at least I haven't seen anybody identify a particular species of bat from an infrared image. Now, there was another question about mating behavior, and again, this is more in the realm of a hypothesis that hasn't been, that is evaluated circumstantially. But some bats, like hoary bat, may exhibit what is called lecking behavior. And I don't know how many of the people on the phone know what a leck is, but right now, you know, outside my window in northern Vermont, I might occasionally see turkeys congregating, 30 to 40 turkeys with maybe 5 males all puffed up and displaying for females. And we call that a leck. And so in the context of bats, you know, you get males collecting, they think, and trying to attract females. And a wind turbine may be an attraction for males, male hoary bats, who are lecking and trying to attract females. We don't have any direct observational evidence of this, but the circumstantial evidence is that many of the hoary bats and other tree bats that are collected as fatalities at the base of wind turbines are in what they might call mating readiness. In other words, the males and the females are ready to mate. And so that may reflect that the bats are collecting around the turbines and trying to mate. But again, we don't have direct evidence to support that. It's more in the realm of hypothesizing and trying to understand why tree bats in particular and hoary bats specifically constitute such a large percentage of bat fatalities reported at wind facilities.
Thank you. Let's switch gears. And somebody asked, are there standard industry best practices for building and operating wind turbines while minimizing hazards to wildlife?
Let me advance the slides here. So in 2012, the Fish and Wildlife Service released guidelines for the siting and operation of land-based wind energy facilities in the U.S. And this set of guidelines was based on the recommendations of a federal advisory committee that met from 2008 to 2010. In the interest of full disclosure, I was a member of that advisory committee. And the committee set up a risk-based approach to guide siting and operation of wind energy facilities in order to minimize impacts to wildlife. That document is available online at the Fish and Wildlife Service website if you're interested. Also, what I would essentially call a companion piece to the guidelines is the publication on the right, A Comprehensive Guide to Studying Wind Energy and Wildlife Interactions, which is organized, this guide is organized to support the implementation of the land-based wind energy guidelines. So it provides descriptions of the kinds, detailed descriptions of the kinds of impacts and risks that should be evaluated and how to essentially intending to function as standards and practices for evaluating risk. So here are the protocols. How do you, if you want to measure bird activity in a pre-construction risk assessment, this guide provides recommended protocols. If you want to collect data do post-construction fatality monitoring, this guide provides protocols for doing that. And this guide is available. It was produced by the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative in 2011, and that document is available on the NWCC website.
Good, thanks. We received a fair number of questions about offshore wind last time, even though you did make clear that that wasn't going to be your focus, but people want to know what, if anything, you can say about it. And so let me read you several questions here, and you could respond to any of these or none of them, depending on what's appropriate. Do you have any sense of how offshore wind wildlife impacts will compare with the impacts on land? And is your organization, the American Wind Wildlife Institute, gearing up to dedicate more time and resources to exploring offshore wind energy development, impacts on marine life and marine birds, now that offshore wind is gaining traction and there are going to be more projects in the pipeline along the Atlantic coast? And then finally, is anyone currently doing work on offshore wind impacts not on birds but on marine mammals? And has any research been done on that in Europe? So that's a lot of questions. You could tackle whichever seem appropriate.
I'll do my best. So there's one operating offshore wind farm in the U.S. off of Block Island, part of Rhode Island, and that's just getting going, and I'm not aware of any data collected to date evaluating the impacts of that project. Europe has an extensive experience with offshore wind. I guess I'd say, unfortunately, they're not, even though there are lots of projects, they're not as heavily studied in the post-construction to provide us with the kind of information that's being asked about. Denmark specifically did some work back in the early 2000s with two offshore wind farms and evaluating sort of the pre-construction environment and post-construction impacts. And we have some lessons from that. And so just, you know, the general question about, I would say, differences between offshore and land-based wind is with respect to birds and bats, there is probably lower bird and bat activity offshore. That would suggest that collision risk to birds and bats offshore is lower. But we can't really evaluate that because the ability to do carcass searches offshore is, to be blunt, non-existent. You really can't do that, and especially in the way that we're able to do it on land. There is research funded by the Department of Energy to develop impact sensors in turbine blades to see whether or not that might be might enable some assessments of collision fatalities, but those aren't available. The technology is still, I would say, under development. There have been studies using radar in Europe to look at the behavior of migrating flocks of waterfowl that purport to show substantial avoidance of wind farms offshore by migrating waterfowl, which has led some to conclude that the collision risk is low. But again, we don't really have the data to evaluate those hypotheses. Bats are known to occur offshore. So, the presence of bats offshore at a wind farm would suggest there's some collision risk, but we can't evaluate the magnitude of that risk or impact. So, there are lots of unanswered questions about comparing bird and bat risk, for example, to offshore versus land-based wind. There are, songbirds migrate across large bodies of water, but we also have all sorts of different species. We have migrating waterfowl, we have seabirds, we have pelagic birds, and we just don't know enough to know what sort of risk there is for those species. The big difference between land-based and offshore wind is the presence of marine mammals and marine reptiles offshore, of course. And there have been some studies in Europe looking at the response of marine mammals, porpoises or dolphins, and seals and sea lions to offshore wind. And there's some suggestion, some indication that these species will be reduced in abundance in the vicinity of a wind farm during construction. So presumably the disturbance associated with pile driving or driving the turbine towers into the substrate and the increased vehicle traffic may cause what we would call displacement, at least temporary displacement. And I should add, similar kinds of effects have been observed in some bird species like red-throated loon and black scoter, or what the Europeans refer to as common scoter. In the U.S., we're particularly concerned with the effects of offshore wind on whales and marine reptiles, turtles, and so on. The risks that are associated with those groups are presumably associated with construction, the noises that are created by pile driving, and the common mitigation recommendation is to avoid pile driving during periods when these mammals and reptiles are likely to be present, and part of that mitigation would include having observers out to see if a whale or migrating whales appear in the project area during installation. And then during operation, there are concerns about the increased boat traffic to service the turbines, and there are recommendations about the speed of vehicles, or pardon me, boats, so that they're able to avoid collisions if whales are present. So it's not a very satisfactory answer in the sense of what we know about impacts, in that we either have a difficult time evaluating risk. The ocean is a very difficult place to get a lot of data, and there are innovative techniques, high-resolution cameras in drones, for example, or planes, to try and get a better sense of the activity of birds and marine mammals and reptiles. And we just don't have the experience in the U.S. to really know what's going on. With respect to AWWI's interests in offshore, I got my start, personally, I got my start in this business, if you will, as a result of evaluating the Cape Wind project when I was at Mass Audubon, and subsequently I was on the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Scientific Advisory Committee. So I have a long-standing interest in this, and at the same time, we have, as an organization, our hands full with our staff in evaluating land-based wind energy impacts and developing solutions for minimizing those impacts. That said, we frequently bring this topic up with our board to talk about whether or not we're going to get more involved in working on offshore wind. And, the short answer is we don't know yet. There's some interest from different, our conservation partners and some of our industry partners, but it hasn't coalesced into a strategic plan yet.
Thank you. I do want to let you and folks on the call know that one of our listeners, Kurt Griffin of University of Massachusetts, wrote in to say, as part of a work funded by the National Science Foundation, UMass is doing extensive research on marine birds and offshore wind, and they also have work underway on marine mammals. That's good to know about. Someone else asked, right. You were talking about marine mammals, is whether any research is being done on the impact of land-based wind turbines on mammals.
There have been a few studies looking at the effects of essentially the presence of a facility on habitat use by ungulates, pronghorn antelope, or mule deer, for example, and elk. And the results to date don't show any impact. In other words, the presence of the turbines does not appear to affect how these animals use the landscape. I don't think we're concerned about direct effects of, more increased mortality. It's more, does the presence of a wind facility cause mule deer or pronghorn to change how they use the landscape so that they avoid the facility? And so far, the data don't suggest any effect. This, as an anecdote, I've spent some time on wind facilities in Wyoming in the summer, which is a very hot, sunny place, and it's not unusual to see pronghorn or mule deer in the shade of the wind turbines.
Interesting.
So they get out of the sun.
Yeah. Interesting. So on the last call, you talked about the difference between death rates of eagles and raptors in the west and the east, and that it has seemed to have been a more severe problem in the west. Can you discuss what might be different between those habitats or the risks or the species that could be leading to that pattern?
So I had a slide prepared here. Some additional work that we've funded, the same project that looked at songbirds mortality is also looking at raptor mortality at wind energy facilities. And this work hasn't been published yet. But these totals that you see here are low and high estimates of the number of raptors killed at wind energy facilities overall and in the east and west, and also the total megawatts in the region. So there are not quite a little bit less than 5 times the amount of installed wind in the west, which in part explains the higher numbers of raptors killed in the west. But there also may be a higher rate, or at least representation, of raptors in fatality monitoring studies projects in the west, which is generally attributed to a higher abundance of raptors in the west. And by west, I'm talking about west of the Mississippi and into the Great Plains and Rockies and so on. And just for context, if people remember, the overall number of birds killed at wind energy facilities, the estimate is somewhere in the range of 250 to 300,000 birds a year. So you can see that raptors are a relatively important percentage of that total. And there is some concern about, and I have a concern about the effects of collisions on populations of some raptor species whose life history suggests that they would be vulnerable to increases in mortality, particularly adult mortality. Once a raptor reaches breeding age, it can have a relatively long life, and if an adult dies, that might have a greater impact on the population than a songbird mortality. And then finally, at the bottom, in the context of the population level impact, overall, it's about 0.5% of the breeding population, which is, if you remember, about 10 times the rate for black-throated blue warbler, which was the highest for songbirds. So, again, it's an indication that raptor mortality at wind energy facilities appears to be a particular risk, avian risk, that we have to pay attention to.
Has any research been done on the impact on migrating insects, such as monarch butterflies?
I'd say the short answer is no. I've seen it referenced in different areas, and I've talked with people who are doing work on monarchs, for example, about their interest in the threat of wind turbines to migrating monarchs, especially because there's a lot of concern about dramatically declining monarch numbers. So the short answer is, I think, like the questioner, there's an interest in whether or not this is something we should worry about or investigate, but I'm not aware that there have been any formal investigations of monarch mortality or mortality of other insects that are of conservation concern.
Okay. And last time you talked about the AWWI landscape assessment tool. If you could remind people what that tool is and whether it's online.
Yes, it is online. It's available at awwi.org. It's a tool that is intended to support what's called preliminary landscape level screening in the wind energy guidelines. There are more than 1,000 data layers, spatial data layers, most of which are showing distributions of species, what are called species of concern, species that are thought to have or known to have risk of impact at wind energy facilities. And the map you're looking at right now is the distribution of golden eagles across the U.S. The green, blue is winter distribution, and green is year-round, and then the blue is orange is summer distribution. And we have similar maps for other bird species, and there are also distribution lists or maps of endangered species, as well as maps of showing distribution of other data layers of conservation concerns, so TNC, Nature Conservancy, priority conservation areas, Audubon important bird areas, wetlands. And so what a company can use this tool for is they can essentially outline a space on the map, and it generates a report and describes the species and conservation resources that can potentially be found within that area. And the company can use that both either as what might be considered a fatal flaw analysis to say, well, you know, this is the only location of this endangered species, so we will avoid this spot. Or it can help them prepare for more detailed field studies of risk by helping them understand what they should be looking for.
Good.
So
well, we're coming to the
publicly available.
Great. We're coming to the end of our time. We have 2 minutes left. Is there anything else you want to say or any questions you want to answer that haven't been asked?
Well, what I would just encourage people to do for those who haven't had a chance either or who didn't get a question addressed or come up with additional questions, AWWI produces a wildlife, what we shorthand referred to as a wildlife impact fact sheet, which is a summary of what we know about the impacts of wind energy on wildlife and what are the remaining uncertainties. And this is a document that we try to update every year. It can be downloaded from our website, and the link is there, or you can just consult the fact sheet on our website. And I encourage people to go check that out, and I'd love to hear from people who have any questions about what's contained, any suggestions they might have to improve it, and if they have additional information that we haven't included.
Hey, thanks very much. You know, I really appreciate your sharing your deep knowledge with us and your ability to answer a wide range of varied questions here. I found this both fascinating and useful, and I'm sure others on the call did as well. So thanks very much. We'll be back in the future with more webinars from the National Northeast Wind Resource Center. Thanks, everyone.